Well, it was just a brutal litany of hunger, thirst, death, beatings, bayoneting, shootings, beheadings.
They suffered a fate worse than death and kept the awful pain to themselves. But now American ex-prisoners of war are breaking their silence. I'm Mike Victor. That story in just a moment.
For Veterans Only is made possible by funding from the Disabled American Veterans, a congressionally chartered nonprofit organization of wartime disabled veterans. The producers thank this station and other public television stations for their assistance and cooperation in making this program available. For Veterans Only is also telecast by the Armed Forces Radio and Television Service for the benefit of the men and women serving on active duty in our armed forces at home and abroad.
For Veterans Only is a national television news magazine for America's veterans and a presentation of Veterans Productions USA. Reporting for Veterans Only is Jim Clay.
When America called, her fighting men came to the front. Many of them gave their lives, and others their limbs. However, the cost of freedom may have fallen heaviest on our prisoners of war, many of whom still suffer mental bondage. But as Mike Victor reports, we are now hearing a broken silence.
And they just beat the hell out of me. I've never had a beating in my life the way they gave me. They threw their hands up in mockery of my surrender. They kicked me below the belt. They blackened both of my eyes, bloody nose.
They are horror stories, and they are real. Enslaved by the enemy, both physically and mentally, many American prisoners of war wished instead that they could have given the ultimate sacrifice, their lives. Many eventually did just that. More than 40% of the Americans captured by the Japanese died, but hundreds of thousands survived the brutal cruelty and raging diseases to return home at war's end. But for the POWs, the battle still raged on and on inside their minds. The feelings of surrender, of watching the enemy take down the American flag, the guilt, the abandonment, and those dreadful nightmares.
One time that I would try to answer their questions, they wouldn't believe me, and so consequently you go into a shell and you won't talk about it at all. Matter of fact, some of my relatives didn't even know.
To come back and say, oh, what did you do in the war? I served 2 years in a prison camp. You just didn't tell them that at that time. It took a number of years before the American people would give respect to the American prisoners of war.
Hard to bear, even tougher to share. While the POW experience differed in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, one thing was the same. They would all have to deal with their bondage the rest of their lives. The difference now is they don't have to do it alone. This POW therapy group at the Spokane VA Medical Center is helping break through the silence. Every Thursday, these ex-POWs gather to help take down a little more of the wall built by the enemy and years of repression.
I don't think a lot of people believe that if you told them the way it was, that you could survive it. I think maybe this is why they come back with the retorts that they do. It wasn't that bad because you lived.
Yeah.
They don't know how bad it was to stay alive either.
They've been through similar things. None of us had the same experience, but there's been enough variation that everybody understands, I think, pretty much what the other fellow didn't have a picnic. And being around them, why, you listen to them talk, and maybe it loosened me up and let me do a little talking that I had held for 40 years, I guess, more.
They also shared a lot of things in terms of what they had happened to them as POWs, and there's a lot of sharing and relatedness as a result of that. POWs have a great affinity for one another, and I was really aware of that, that they began to solve some of the problems that they had together and to share some of the things that they had.
There is now an ex-POW therapy group like this at almost all VA medical centers. The larger ones have 3 or 4 groups. The goal is to get their experiences and feelings out on the table, regardless of how bad. Sam Graccio is just beginning to release some of the horrors of Bataan he has kept inside for 47 years.
Both sides of the roads were littered with dead bodies. Lads that had dysentery, and of course, you know, dysentery will dehydrate you very, very rapidly. And without water, many of them collapsed because of that condition. And if you weren't able to keep up with the march pace, and you fell out, that was certain death. They'd shoot you or bayonet you. I was in Camp O'Donnell, which was followed the March of Death, and I was in there for 2 months. And during the 2 months that I was in prison there were 1,100 Americans and 14,000 Filipinos that died in that one prison camp.
Sam said he had only two choices, exist or die, but he found a third, escape. On work detail, he and several others fled into the jungle from the Duval Penal Colony in the Philippines. A guerrilla resistance group helped them locate the U.S. submarine Bullfin. At 87 pounds, Sam was too weak to climb aboard.
I remember I got on board about 7:30. I remember they dropped off a rope ladder off the side of the submarine, and I started climbing up the damn thing. I didn't have enough strength to get up. He just literally picked me up like a sack of flour, because I did. Like I say, I weighed about 85 pounds then. He picked me up and he got me on the bridge.
The possibility of escape kept hope alive for the POWs. Many of them were made to work at hard labor, which gave them opportunities for escape and for sabotage, anything to slow down the enemy's progress. The movie, The Great Escape, was about real people.
When we built a tunnel, which was over 300 yards long, from one of the barracks all the way out to the fence in The Big Escape, we had railroad tracks, we pushed carts under there, we had rooms, we had electric light bulbs strung under there in the tunnel. We also had many factories, as we'd call them. We'd have a factory to make clothes, civilian clothes. Like if we had a successful escape, we would outfit a fellow with civilian clothes. One escape we had in our camp, they made German uniforms and they made German guns.
Brutal treatment of POWs in disregard for the Geneva Convention was carried out by the Germans too. For many, the German death march of 1945 was their last, and in the eyes of Hitler's men, attempted escape meant death.
Some 79 Britishers got out, and the Germans, Gestapo at that time, killed 49 of the 79 that got out, took them out in the field and just shot them. And they told us at that time that escape is no longer a sport, and that they would shoot anybody trying to escape.
6 years later, thousands more American POWs were suffering the same dose of brutality in Korea at the hands of the communists. Then once again in Vietnam, Americans were paying the huge cost of freedom. The Viet Cong captors employed every type of physical brutality, but their mental cruelty was even worse.
You couldn't call it a cell because it had no windows and it had a solid door. You couldn't look out. You had no radio, no TV, no newspaper, no book, nothing of any outside stimulus of any kind.
Probably in Vietnam, more use of psychological warfare against the prisoners. They would always hear every single thing that went wrong in America, as opposed to just hearing general things from the Japanese, that America is imperialist or they're bad in some way. The actual Vietnam POWs got specific information from the North Vietnamese about every disaster or every riot in Watts or everything that had gone wrong in America. They were fed that, and it was in some ways more difficult to keep your morale up.
I should have been in a group like this many, many years ago when I could have, would have saved me a lot of worry and trouble and problems.
Since this group held its first meeting in 1981, hundreds have been helped. Their biggest problem, deep feelings of guilt associated with surrender, the feeling that they had let down their country, feelings of selfishness.
And the guilt feelings were hitting me pretty hard. Because
Objectively, there really are no reasons why these veterans have to feel guilty for surrendering, but sometimes the feeling comes up there anyway. And that's part really of post-traumatic stress disorder. That is, that you feel guilt even though there may not be a reason to feel guilty.
Help for these veterans was long in coming. After World War II, medical exams for returning POWs were grossly inadequate, mostly due to the large number of returning troops. The pervading attitude, the war is over, let's go home, all's well now. Even the POWs themselves minimized their problems to get home quicker. But recent studies on PTSD have helped gain an understanding of the complex problems of POWs. And Congress helped with a 1981 law giving veterans access to the VA medical system, even if their problems are not service-connected. So finally, veterans are getting help understanding the hurt inside them.
It's been a help to me because you're with your buddies. There's a very, very strong bond amongst prisoners of war. I mean, it's very, very spontaneous. You meet another prisoner of war and right away he's your brother. You love the guy. And there's a mutual respect. What's helped me is listening to other people because they identify similar problems, and I don't feel that I'm alone on this. That this is typical of a prisoner. That they do experience sometimes these guilt feelings, and sometimes they refer to it now as a delayed stress syndrome. I know I have it. So this delayed stress syndrome thing is not something that's a figment of the imagination. It's fact, it's true. People have it, and I think most of us have it.
Family relationships which were disturbed or broken are being mended.
From the wives, they're generally saying that he talks to me a lot more, specifically about himself and how he feels about himself, but also about those POW events that he may have protected from her all these years. That is, in that generation, there are lots of protection of the female that she and others in the family, that they may be overwhelmed by the things that had happened.
Having been prisoners with no release date to look for, POWs as a whole say they value their freedom and their country beyond all else.
If you commit a crime, a robbery, a burglary, you're given 5 years, you could mark it off on the calendar. When you're in prison, during wartime, as an ex-prisoner of war, you don't know when you're going to get out of jail, if you're ever going to get out. You have no calendar to mark off, you have nothing to go by as to. You can hope and pray. You do a lot of prayers in prison camp. I did.
You got plenty of water, you got plenty of food, you can go into stores, they're full of things, and you couldn't have it better. And then you think of these people around the rest of the world that are dying and starving and getting the hell beat out of them every day, and they can't move without fear of dying. And that's what we lived with for years, the fear of dying every day. You got where you just had to turn it off, but you were always under the gun.
Some POWs from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam are still unaccounted for. Those who have made it home are begging America to search harder for their comrades.
We, as a nation and as a people, have an obligation to verify that, to account for each and every individual in the best manner that we can. And that effort should never cease, it should never stop until it's complete.
Though rejected in the past, former POWs are finally receiving the honors they deserve. It may only be a small medal or a distinctive license plate, but the gesture says, thanks for the price you paid.
I think Americans ought to be aware of the extent of sacrifice that POWs have given. They have suffered more in service of their country than any other group ever has.
Therapy groups, aggressive research, and a new understanding of the veterans' contribution has helped these ex-POWs realize that there is no longer a reason to fight their battles alone. The cruel memories will be with them every day of their lives, but the burden is lighter because we are all now sharing in the sounds of their broken silence.
Because veterans' benefits are constantly changing, the Department of Veterans Affairs has prepared a special booklet entitled A Guide to Veterans' Benefits. For a free copy of this informative and timely publication, write to VA Hotline, Post Office Box 1777, Louisville, Kentucky 40201. If you're experiencing a particular problem in qualifying for veterans' entitlements, the Department of Veterans Affairs will provide you with direct assistance. Address your correspondence to VA Hotline, Post Office Box 1777, Louisville, Kentucky 40201.
They are called the Oscars of the veterans community. From Washington, Mary Miller reports on an award ceremony which honors some very distinguished Americans.
Some 600 AMVETS members from all over the country gathered here in Washington late last month for a most special occasion, their 32nd annual awards banquet. This is the prize, a silver replica of the World War II GI helmet, and honors both public figures and private citizens for outstanding accomplishment in the fields of Americanism, defense, rehabilitation, congressional service, civil service, community service, peace, and special achievement.
But these awards is the highest award that this organization can give.
This year, there were 6 Silver Helmet Award recipients. New Waterford, Ohio businessman Raymond Hess received the AMVET of the Year award. He was cited for exceptional leadership in the AMVETS organization, having held every office in his hometown post right up to state commander in his 30 years as a member. He's especially known for his emphasis on community outreach and service programs, particularly on behalf of hospitalized or disabled veterans. Hess says his work is the result of his rage against America's World War II foes, having turned into a steadfast commitment to peace.
But after I became of age and joined the United States Air Force first, and then the United States Army, and served a tour of duty in Japan, and saw firsthand what an atomic bomb can do to a country and its people, I pray to God it never happens again on this planet.
The Silver Helmet Special Award went to another Ohioan. WCMH-TV sports director Jimmy Crum was honored for his compassion and service on behalf of handicapped children. He has spearheaded numerous charitable projects, among them a nonprofit fund he started 24 years ago that has raised more than $3 million to send handicapped children to summer camp. He's also lent his support to a host of other service organizations like Special Olympics and Easter Seals. Crum says he wouldn't trade his 36 years in Columbus for the glitz of major market TV some colleagues have chosen for anything in the world.
As Woody Hayes, the great Ohio State football coach, used to say, "You can never pay back, but you can pay forward." And I have just tried to give back to Columbus some of the good things that Columbus has given to me and to my family.
A Buffalo, New York tavern owner and decorated World War II Marine veteran won the Silver Helmet Americanism Award for his efforts in helping the needy. Dick Michael has raised thousands of dollars to feed the hungry and send cancer-stricken children to summer camp. One of his more popular fundraisers is an Ugliest Bartender contest, which he's managed to win 3 times.
Anybody who says I'm ugly, I appreciate it, because I worked very hard to be ugly, and it helped raise a lot of money for the charities. I'm thankful I'm an American. I'm thankful I'm an AMVET. I'm thankful to Post 45 for all they've done and the help they've done for me. And each and every person concerned with bringing this to me, I sincerely thank you from the very, very bottom of my heart.
It was New York Republican Representative Gerald Solomon who won this year's Silver Helmet Congressional Award. As the ranking minority member on the House Veterans Affairs Committee for a decade, Solomon was credited with either sponsoring or co-sponsoring all major veterans legislation, including the historical raising of the Veterans Administration to a cabinet-level department this year. Solomon says he's fought for veterans programs not just because they are owed for past services rendered, but also because they should be insurance against the future.
All of the programs that we have, those are incentives for young people today volunteering to serve our country. And if you could go as I have gone out throughout this land of ours, at all of the recruit depots, for all of the branches of the military that all of you served in, you would be so proud today of those young men and women. And yes, we do have to do everything that we can for them. And we have to promise them a future once they've given their time to their country on a volunteer basis.
A 29-year-old Southeastern Massachusetts University chemical engineering professor received the Silver Helmet Rehabilitation Award. Philip Weil has spent years developing computerized machines to help disabled people communicate, and he brought some along to demonstrate how they work. On this one, a single movement, here with a thumb, but for others perhaps an eye, eyebrow, knee, or foot, on a single switch activates the system.
If I wanted to say something like, "I am fine," I wait until this spot gets over the column with the letter I, and then I'd press the switch. Once I press the switch, it starts going down that column, framing each letter. When the letter I is framed, I hit the switch again, and the letter I appears in the viewing area.
And so on until a whole message is on the screen.
I could now speak that message by picking this entry in the first column, talk, and lo and behold,
I am fine.
now, that's a robotic-sounding voice, but for someone who's never been able to speak, something like I am fine or happy birthday, Mom, love Linda, that's a wonderful voice.
For those with more finger dexterity, there is a machine to communicate by whole sentences. Vile's acceptance speech was a call to action.
But those of us who have strengths, it is up to us to help our disabled people who have what we perceive as weaknesses, and together we can make the world a better place for our disabled citizens. And by doing that, we can make this country even greater than it already is.
Unable to attend to accept his Silver Helmet Peace Award was former Secretary of State George Shultz. Shultz was honored for more than 30 years of public service, particularly for demonstrating uncommon diplomacy and leadership in the area of Soviet-American relations during his tenure under President Ronald Reagan, resulting in improved international relations. It was indeed an evening to honor America by honoring some of its most unselfish citizens. For Veterans Only, I'm Mary Miller in Washington.
Our Valor Series continues this week with Brian Patrick visiting with one of the best-known POWs from the Vietnam War. He's in Tucson, Arizona, at the home of a retired Air Force fighter pilot who spent more than 5 years in captivity.
He was born on the 4th of July in 1925, and as he grew up, young Laird Gutterson dreamed of being a fighter pilot and a hero. In the midst of World War II, he dropped out of high school and signed up with the Army Air Corps. His career took many twists and turns, flying B-25s till the war ended, then back to civilian life for a while before joining the new Air Force Reserves and returning to active duty to fly the F-51 Mustang in Korea, where he was wounded on a special mission.
Where we were trying to skip some bombs into a railroad tunnel. And I knew that I was going to be a sitting duck when I came off the top of that hill, because I climbed up the side of the mountain that had the railroad tunnel at the bottom of it. And, you know, we got armor plating underneath us, but I was upside down. So the bullet hit the armor plating and bounced into me. And it rolled across my spine. It's paralyzed me the waist down, and I recovered the aircraft and flew back with trim tabs, made the lightest landing ever recorded at Kempo Air Base at Seoul.
After Korea, Gutterson earned a commission in the regular Air Force, working as a flight instructor, recruiter, and as a lecturer at the Air University. Specializing in psychological indoctrination and the POW Code of Conduct, he could not have known then that he was preparing for the 5 most difficult years of his life as a prisoner of war in North Vietnam. At age 41, after serving with the NATO command in Germany, flying transport missions in Southeast Asia, and working at the Pentagon, Major Gutterson volunteered to return to Vietnam as a fighter pilot, moving his family to Tucson, Arizona, where he trained in the F-4 Phantom.
It was kind of scary. You felt like you were strapped, you know, onto 2 rockets and just hanging on. But I checked out, managed to get 1 air-to-air refueling in before I had to leave for Vietnam, and then went to survival school and then off to Yuban, Thailand.
In December of 1967, Gutterson was shot down and rescued from the frigid waters of the Gulf of Tonkin, but was back in the cockpit in just a few days.
I wanted to be a hero, so I kept volunteering to go up and fly daylight missions as well as night missions against the MiG. So finally they let 4 of us out of our squadron form a detachment that went up during the daylight hours with a regular wing gaggle that was going up, and see if we could chase some MiGs and become heroes. Unfortunately, I got chased instead of chasing.
Shot down over North Vietnam, Gutterson was captured and taken prisoner, tortured, and interrogated.
It becomes a game then, and basically after the first 24 hours, all they're trying to do is make you submissive. They're just trying to get you subservient so that you'll automatically say yes whenever they want you to do something.
With his background in the Code of Conduct and psychological indoctrination, Major Gutterson learned quickly to survive in captivity.
I found the biggest thing I had to overcome was the fear. You can't afford to overcome it with hatred because that tears you up. And so I started basically, in essence, praying for the least of his children, which had to be Big Ug, the guy that was beating me up and torturing me. And I prayed for him twice a day, feeling like a hypocrite.
Because he refused to cooperate for an early release, P.O.W. Gutterson spent months on end in solitary, knowing there was little hope of being rescued.
I had studied the POW situation from Korea and from World War II. I had seen the classified documents which since have been released that showed that we left people behind in both of those wars. And I knew we were not going to get rescued. I knew that the only way we were going to get out of there is if the Vietnamese decided to let us out, and that would be up for grabs whether they would or not. So I might be there for 40 years.
He knew he needed a goal, so his daily routine included planning for his release.
And I would relive it for about 30 minutes to an hour in the morning.
Did you ever get the feeling you were going crazy?
No. Every morning I woke up, I was alive, and there were a lot of people who weren't. And there were a lot of people that weren't going to make it. But I was bound determined that for that day at least, everything was great until it turned worse.
Are there POWs in Vietnam today?
There sure are. And I said that the 3 days after I came home. You know why? Because I read history. I don't know a single one or who they are, and I've not seen them, and I couldn't identify them. But I've read history. In every war, the communists have kept their prisoners. I said, when a communist comes to a negotiating table and gives you a list of names, you have to assume that it's only half as long as he could make it, because that's how he's taught to negotiate. I said, we don't have anybody that came out of Laos. Where are all the 600 aircrew members who were lost in Laos? None of them came home.
Today, Laird Gutterson travels around the country, talking with anyone who will listen about the POW MIA issue. 10,000 Americans wore a POW bracelet with his name on it thanks to the leadership of his late wife and sister early in the movement. Those people were his reason to live through 61 months of hell.
And these people were the people who I felt would be happier if I stayed alive than if I died. And so they became my support system.
Widowed in 1978 after losing a bitterly contested race for an Arizona congressional seat, Laird Gutterson has since remarried and enjoys life in the Tucson foothills, spending time with his children and grandchildren and spreading his message throughout the land.
Once you've lost freedom, you really learn to appreciate it.
Coming up in May, a Vietnam Veterans Reunion for Kentucky's 110,000 Vietnam vets at the Belvedere in Louisville. The first-time event takes place on May 20th, starting at noon. And in San Pedro, California, groundbreaking ceremonies will take place for an International Korean War Memorial on June 25th. Coming up on next week's program, Brian Patrick will be visiting a Veterans Job Fair sponsored by NCOA in El Paso, Texas. And Mary Miller reports from Washington on the House Veterans Affairs Committee's oversight hearings on veterans employment and training issues. And Dennis West returns with VA Hotline with a segment on cardiology. All that and more next week on For Veterans Only. Until then, I'm Jim Clay. Thanks very much for joining us. And remember, when you need someone to count on, you can always count on a veteran.
For Veterans Only is made possible by funding from the Disabled American Veterans, a congressionally chartered nonprofit organization of wartime disabled veterans. The producers thank this station and other public television stations for their assistance and cooperation in making this program available. For Veterans Only is also telecast by the Armed Forces Radio and Television Service for the benefit of the men and women serving on active duty in our armed forces at home and abroad.